I've been diabetic since I was 8. I heard my girlfriend tell her sister, he doesn't know I've been replacing his insulin with saline. She replied, if he survives long enough to figure it out, we lose the life insurance. I called the police immediately. The words came through the bedroom door so clearly I thought I'd misheard them at first. I'd gotten up to use the bathroom at 2:18 a.m., and when I came back down the hallway, I heard my girlfriend Natalie's voice mixed with her sister Rebecca's, both of them talking in hushed tones in our living room. I stopped just before the door, my hand on the frame, and that's when Rebecca said it. If he survives long enough to figure it out, we lose the life insurance. My legs went numb. The hallway tilted sideways, and I had to brace myself against the wall to keep from falling. I'd been diabetic since I was 8 years old, had managed my condition carefully for 23 years, and the woman I'd been planning to marry had apparently been trying to kill me slowly by replacing my insulin with saline solution. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my blood sugar spike from the pure adrenaline flooding my system. I'd been living what I thought was a stable, happy life for the past 2 years when everything started to unravel. I worked as a graphic designer for a marketing agency, managed my type 1 diabetes with the same careful routine I'd maintained since childhood, and had met Natalie at a friend's wedding where we'd bonded over our mutual love of terrible action movies and craft beer. She'd seemed perfect, supportive of my medical condition without being overbearing, understanding when I needed to check my blood sugar or take my insulin, even learning to recognize the signs of hypoglycemia so she could help if I ever had an emergency. We'd moved in together 6 months ago, and she'd integrated seamlessly into my life, taking on small responsibilities like picking up my insulin prescription when I was busy at work or reminding me to check my levels if she noticed I was acting off. I'd trusted her completely with my health and my life, and now I was standing in my own hallway learning that trust had been weaponized to murder me. The first escalation had started about 3 months ago, though I hadn't recognized it as such at the time. My blood sugar readings had started becoming erratic in ways they hadn't been in years. I'd wake up with readings in the 300s, despite taking my long-acting insulin the night before. I'd crash to dangerous lows in the middle of the afternoon, even though I'd eaten properly and dosed correctly. My endocrinologist, Dr. Eleanor Finch, who'd been managing my diabetes for 8 years, was baffled by the sudden instability. She'd run tests, adjusted my dosages, switched me to different insulin formulations, but nothing seemed to help. I'd chalked it up to stress from a big project at work, or maybe just my body changing as I got older. Diabetes was unpredictable sometimes, I'd told myself. These things happened. But they didn't just happen. Not like this. Not all at once. Someone had been causing it deliberately, and I'd been too trusting to see what was right in front of me. The second escalation came when I started finding things that didn't quite add up. Small vials in the bathroom trash that looked like my insulin vials but were labeled differently. When I'd asked Natalie about them, she'd said they were B12 shots her sister Rebecca was taking, that Rebecca had asked her to dispose of them because her own apartment's plumbing was broken. It had sounded plausible at the time. Rebecca was always having some crisis or another, always needed help with something. I'd believed the explanation because why wouldn't I? But now, standing in that hallway listening to them discuss my death like it was a business transaction, I realized those vials had been saline. Natalie had been filling my insulin pens with saline solution, disposing of the evidence, and watching me deteriorate while pretending to be the concerned girlfriend, helping me manage my mysterious health decline. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and opened the voice recorder app. My fingers were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone, but I managed to start recording and held it up near the crack in the door. I needed evidence. I needed someone to believe me when I reported this, because it sounded insane even to me. Natalie's voice came through clear on the recording. He's been getting worse faster than I expected. The hospital visit last week really scared him. His doctor wants to admit him for observation if his numbers don't stabilize soon. Rebecca laughed, actually laughed, and said, "That's perfect. If he dies in the hospital, they'll just think his diabetes finally caught up with him. No one's going to test his insulin. No one's going to suspect anything. We just need to make sure the policy is active for the full 6 months before anything happens. Otherwise, the insurance company might investigate." 6 months. The life insurance policy I didn't even know existed had apparently been taken out 6 months ago, right around the time Natalie moved in with me. The third escalation had been my hospitalization 2 weeks ago, though I was only now understanding what had actually caused it. I'd collapsed at work with blood sugar readings over 450, confused and vomiting, barely conscious when the ambulance arrived. The ER doctors had treated me for diabetic ketoacidosis, a life-threatening complication that happens when your body doesn't have enough insulin to process glucose. They'd kept me for 3 days, running tests and monitoring my levels, trying to figure out why someone who'd been managing their diabetes successfully for over 2 decades had suddenly ended up in DKA. Dr. Finch had visited me in the hospital, reviewed my medication logs, checked my insulin pens, and found nothing obviously wrong. The insulin had been stored properly, hadn't expired, showed no signs of contamination. She'd attributed the episode to possible infection or stress, told me to monitor my levels even more carefully, and sent me home with strict instructions to come back immediately if I felt even slightly off. I'd left that hospital grateful that Natalie had been there every day, holding my hand, bringing me books and snacks, playing the role of devoted girlfriend while she was actually counting down the days until the insurance policy matured enough to pay out. I stood in that hallway for another 5 minutes, recording everything they said, documenting their plan in their own words. They discussed dosages of saline, timing of my doses, how to make sure I kept taking what I thought was insulin without getting suspicious. Rebecca mentioned that she'd read online that gradual replacement was safer than immediate substitution because it would look more like natural disease progression. Natalie agreed, said she'd been replacing about 30% of each dose for the first month, then increased to 50%, and was now giving me pure saline in my long-acting insulin pen. My rapid-acting insulin for meals was still real, she said, because she needed me to maintain some blood sugar control, or I'd end up hospitalized too quickly, and they'd discover the substitution. The clinical precision of their planning made my stomach turn. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was calculated murder, planned over months, executed with deliberate care. When I'd heard enough, when I had 10 minutes of recorded conversation detailing their entire scheme, I walked quietly back to the bedroom and locked the door. My hands were still shaking as I dialed 911, and when the dispatcher answered, I could barely get the words out. "My girlfriend is trying to kill me," I said, and my voice cracked on the words. "She's been replacing my insulin with saline. I'm a type 1 diabetic. She's trying to kill me for life insurance money. I have a recording of her admitting it to her sister right now in my living room." The dispatcher's voice became immediately sharp and focused. She asked for my address, asked if I was in immediate danger, asked if I had my real insulin available. I told her I thought all my insulin in the apartment might be compromised, that I needed police and I needed paramedics, that I was locking myself in my bedroom until help arrived. She stayed on the line with me, talking calmly while dispatching units, and I could hear her typing rapidly, flagging this as an attempted murder in progress. The police arrived within 8 minutes, and I heard Natalie answer the door with her usual charming voice, asking what the problem was. Rebecca was apparently trying to leave through the back, but officers had already surrounded the apartment building. I unlocked the bedroom door when I heard Detective James Kowalski identify himself, a 15-year veteran of the homicide division, who later told me this was one of the most disturbing cases he'd handled in his career. He came into the bedroom with 2 other officers, and I showed him the recording on my phone. We played it back right there, Natalie's voice coming through clear as day, explaining how she'd been systematically replacing my life-saving medication with harmless saline, slowly killing me while playing the role of supportive girlfriend. Kowalski's face went hard and cold as he listened, and when the recording finished, he looked at me and said, "We're going to need to secure all your insulin and medical supplies as evidence. Do you have any medication that you know for certain hasn't been tampered with?" I told him I'd picked up a new prescription 3 days ago from a pharmacy across town, a prescription Natalie didn't know about because I'd gone on my lunch break without mentioning it. I'd been experiencing such erratic blood sugars that Dr. Finch had wanted me to try a different formulation, and I'd kept the new pens in my work bag instead of in the refrigerator at home. Kowalski sent an officer to retrieve the bag from my car, and while we waited, paramedics arrived to check my current blood sugar and make sure I wasn't in immediate medical danger. The reading was 287, high, but not critically so, and they wanted to transport me to the hospital for observation, given what I'd just discovered. But I refused to leave until I saw Natalie and Rebecca arrested. I needed to see them taken away in handcuffs, needed that visual confirmation that they wouldn't be able to hurt me again. Detective Kowalski went back to the living room where other officers were detaining both women, and I heard Natalie's voice shift from charming to panicked as she realized what was happening. She started demanding to know what I'd told the police, claiming I was having a diabetic episode and wasn't thinking clearly, insisting she'd done nothing wrong. Rebecca tried a different approach, staying silent and asking for a lawyer immediately. Kowalski didn't engage with either of them beyond reading them their rights. He had officers bag and tag every insulin vial, every pen, every bottle of saline solution they found in the apartment. They found Natalie's laptop open on the coffee table with an internet browser showing searches for "How long does it take to die from untreated diabetes?" and "Can autopsy detect insulin substitution?" They found paperwork for a life insurance policy on me worth $500,000, a policy I'd never signed or even known existed, but that had my forged signature on the application. The fourth escalation came when Kowalski had a forensics team come to the apartment to test my insulin supplies. They used portable testing equipment to analyze the contents of my insulin pens, and out of the 8 pens in my refrigerator, 6 came back as pure saline solution with no insulin present whatsoever. 2 still had partial insulin mixed with saline, probably the ones Natalie hadn't finished replacing yet. The forensics technician, a woman named Dr. Lisa Hoffman, who'd been doing crime scene analysis for 12 years, told me that if I'd continued using these pens at my prescribed doses, I would have been dead within 2 to 3 weeks. My body had been running on minimal insulin for months, and the only reason I'd survived was because of the small amounts in my mealtime doses and probably some residual insulin production from my pancreas that hadn't completely shut down. She said I was lucky I'd discovered the plot when I did, that another week or 2 of this, and I'd have ended up in a diabetic coma that would have killed me before anyone realized what was actually wrong. I rode to the hospital in an ambulance while Natalie and Rebecca were taken to the police station in separate patrol cars. Dr. Finch met me in the emergency room, and when I explained what had been happening, I watched her face go through shock, horror, and then professional fury. She immediately ordered comprehensive tests to determine how much damage had been done to my body by months of inadequate insulin. My A1C, a measure of average blood sugar over 3 months, had risen from my usual well-controlled 6.2% to a dangerous 11.8%. I had early signs of diabetic ketoacidosis brewing in my system. My kidneys were showing stress markers from processing excessive glucose. Dr. Finch told me bluntly that if this had continued much longer, I would have suffered permanent organ damage or death, and there would have been very little anyone could have done to save me. She also told me that she was going to personally ensure that every piece of medical evidence was documented and preserved for the prosecution, that she'd never had a patient victimized like this, and she was going to make sure justice was served. The institutional involvement intensified over the next several days. The police executed search warrants on both Natalie's and Rebecca's phones, computers, and financial records. What they found was even worse than I'd imagined. Text messages between the sisters going back 7 months, discussing me like I was a mark in a con game. Rebecca had apparently done this before, helped her last boyfriend accidentally die in a way that paid out life insurance, but they'd never been caught because the death was ruled natural causes related to his pre-existing heart condition. She'd coached Natalie through the entire process, taught her how to forge my signature on insurance documents, how to gradually replace my insulin so the decline would look natural, even how to act concerned and supportive so no one would suspect her involvement. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a veteran attorney named Michael Thornton, who'd been handling major crimes for 18 years, told me this was one of the most premeditated murder attempts he'd ever prosecuted. The evidence was overwhelming, the planning was documented in excruciating detail, and he was confident both women would spend decades in prison. The crisis peak came when I was released from the hospital after 3 days of stabilization and monitoring, and I had to go back to the apartment to collect my belongings. The police had cleared it as a crime scene, but everything felt contaminated now, every room filled with memories that I now understood were lies. I walked through the living room where Natalie and I had watched movies together, where she'd laughed at my jokes and planned our future, and all I could see was the spot where she'd stood admitting to her sister that she was murdering me for money. I went to the bathroom and saw the insulin pens in the refrigerator that the forensics team had left behind after testing, marked with evidence tags, and I felt physically sick, knowing I'd been injecting saline into my body while Natalie watched and smiled and asked if I felt okay. My best friend Kevin came to help me pack, and he kept apologizing like this was somehow his fault for introducing me to Natalie at that wedding 2 years ago. I told him no one could have predicted this, that Natalie had been a professional predator who'd learned how to spot and exploit vulnerable targets, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. I moved into a temporary apartment while the legal proceedings played out, and Detective Kowalski kept me updated on the investigation's progress. They'd found evidence that Rebecca had been involved in at least 2 other suspicious deaths over the past decade, both men she'd been in relationships with who'd died from complications of pre-existing conditions and left her as the beneficiary on life insurance policies. The cases were being reopened, bodies were being exhumed, investigators were going back through medical records with new eyes. Natalie had been Rebecca's accomplice in at least one of those deaths, and possibly both. They'd been running this scheme for years, targeting men with chronic health conditions that could be exploited, forming relationships to gain access and trust, then systematically killing them in ways that looked natural. I was supposed to be their 3rd victim, but I'd gotten lucky because I'd woken up to use the bathroom at exactly the right moment to overhear their conversation. That random chance had saved my life, and potentially prevented them from killing again. The resolution came in stages over the next 8 months. Natalie was charged with attempted murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder. Rebecca faced the same charges plus 2 counts of murder in connection with the reopened cases. The evidence against both of them was overwhelming. The recording I'd made, the text messages, the internet search history, the forged insurance documents, the testimony from Dr. Finch about my medical decline, the forensic analysis of my insulin showing deliberate substitution. Natalie's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd been manipulated by Rebecca, that she was a victim too, but the text messages showed she'd been an enthusiastic participant in planning my death. Rebecca's attorney tried to get the charges reduced by claiming insufficient evidence in the old cases, but forensic pathologists re-examined the previous victims and found evidence consistent with medical neglect or poisoning that had been missed during the original investigations. The trial was held 9 months after my 2:18 a.m. discovery, and I had to sit in that courtroom and listen to forensic experts describe in clinical detail how close I'd come to dying. Dr. Hoffman testified about the insulin analysis, explaining that the saline substitution had been done carefully and systematically, showing clear intent to harm rather than accidental contamination. Dr. Finch testified about my medical records, the dramatic decline in my health over the months Natalie had been tampering with my medication, and how my symptoms were entirely consistent with inadequate insulin therapy. The insurance investigator testified about the forged policy documents, explaining that Natalie had created an entire false paper trail, making it look like I'd applied for the life insurance myself when I'd never even been aware of its existence. And I testified about the relationship, about how Natalie had gained my trust, about overhearing that conversation and realizing the woman I loved was systematically murdering me. Natalie maintained her innocence throughout the trial, claiming I'd misunderstood the conversation I'd recorded, that she'd been joking with her sister about a television show we'd been watching. But the prosecution played the full 10-minute recording, and there was no ambiguity in their words. They discussed specific dosages, timelines, insurance payout schedules, and their previous success with this method. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both women. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Drummond, who'd been on the bench for 23 years, called this one of the most callous and calculated crimes she'd encountered in her career. She sentenced Natalie to 45 years in prison without possibility of parole for 25 years. Rebecca received life without parole for the 2 murders, plus the attempted murder of me. As they were led out of the courtroom in shackles, Natalie finally dropped the mask of innocence she'd been wearing and looked directly at me with pure hatred in her eyes. She mouthed words I couldn't quite make out, but I didn't need to hear them. She'd lost, and we both knew it. The aftermath of the trial was complex and painful in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd survived the physical attempt on my life, but the psychological damage was harder to quantify. I went to therapy with a counselor named Dr. Raymond Shaw, who specialized in trauma recovery and criminal victimization, and he helped me understand that what I was feeling was normal given the circumstances. Trust issues were expected when someone you loved tried to murder you. Hypervigilance about my medical care was reasonable after someone tampered with my life-saving medication. The nightmares where I woke up checking my blood sugar at 2:18 a.m. every night were a trauma response that would fade with time. Dr. Shaw said recovery from this kind of betrayal took years, not months, and I needed to be patient with myself as I rebuilt my sense of safety in the world. He also connected me with a support group for people who'd survived attempted murder by intimate partners, and hearing other people's stories made me feel less alone in what I was going through. My relationship with my own diabetes changed fundamentally after this experience. I'd been managing my condition independently since I was a teenager, confident in my ability to handle it alone. Now, I had Dr. Finch check every new prescription personally, verified the contents with testing strips before using any insulin, and kept all my supplies locked in a safe that only I had the combination to. I went back to living alone. Couldn't imagine trusting another person with access to my medication or my medical information. Friends and family tried to set me up on dates, insisted I couldn't let Natalie's actions destroy my ability to form new relationships, but I wasn't ready. Maybe I'd never be ready. The idea of being vulnerable with someone again, of letting them into my life deeply enough to help with my diabetes management, felt impossible. Natalie had turned my medical condition into a weapon against me, and I couldn't unknow that vulnerability. The financial recovery was another complicated process. The forged life insurance policy was voided once the fraud was discovered, but I still had to deal with identity theft issues because Natalie had used my personal information to open the policy and several credit cards I'd never known about. I worked with a lawyer named David Sinclair, who specialized in identity theft recovery and had been practicing for 14 years, and he helped me navigate the process of clearing my credit, documenting the fraud, and ensuring none of the debts Natalie had accumulated in my name would affect my financial future. The apartment we'd shared together had been in my name, and I'd had to break the lease and forfeit my security deposit because I couldn't bear to live there anymore. Between legal fees, moving costs, medical bills from my hospitalization, and therapy expenses, the whole experience cost me close to $30,000 even though insurance covered some of it. Natalie's conviction included a restitution order, but Sinclair told me realistically I'd never see that money. She didn't have assets to seize, and prison wages wouldn't make a dent in what she owed me. 1 year after that night when I overheard Natalie and Rebecca plotting my death, I was in a different apartment, working at a different job because my old workplace had too many memories of collapsing at my desk, seeing a therapist weekly, and slowly rebuilding something that felt like a life. Dr. Finch told me my A1C had come back down to 6.5%, not quite as good as before, but dramatically improved from the 11.8% it had reached during Natalie's substitution campaign. My kidneys had recovered fully from the stress, and there didn't appear to be any permanent organ damage. I'd been lucky, she said. Lucky in ways most people in my situation weren't. If I'd been less attentive to my health, if I hadn't picked up that extra prescription, if I hadn't woken up at exactly the right moment to hear that conversation, I'd be dead. The randomness of my survival bothered me sometimes, kept me awake wondering about all the small choices that had led to me being alive while Natalie's previous victims hadn't been so fortunate. I visited the families of Rebecca's other victims, the 2 men whose deaths were now understood to be murders rather than natural causes. One was a man named Thomas Wheeler who died of a heart attack at age 39, survived by a wife and 2 young children who'd spent the past 6 years believing his death was just tragic bad luck. The other was a man named Anthony Ruiz, who died of complications from lupus at 42, leaving behind elderly parents who'd never recovered from losing their only child. Both families were grateful that the truth had finally emerged, that their loved ones' deaths were being recognized as the crimes they'd been, but the revelation also reopened old wounds. Thomas's widow told me she'd spent years blaming herself for not noticing he was getting sicker, for not insisting he see better doctors. Now she knew he'd been seeing doctors. They just hadn't realized he was being poisoned because Rebecca had been so careful. Anthony's mother told me she'd always felt something was wrong about how quickly he'd deteriorated, but she'd been dismissed as a grief-stricken parent in denial. Having her instincts validated years later brought a complicated mix of relief and rage. The media coverage of the case was extensive and uncomfortable. Black Widow sisters convicted of multiple murders ran as a headline in every major paper. True crime podcasts did episodes analyzing the case, dissecting every detail of how Natalie and Rebecca had operated. I declined all interview requests, Didn't want to become a public figure defined by being almost murdered, but some of the coverage happened anyway. Photos of me from social media were published without my permission. Reporters showed up at my new apartment building trying to get comments. I had to change my phone number twice because people kept calling wanting to hear the story directly. The prosecutor's office tried to shield me from the worst of it, but there was only so much they could do once the trial became public record. Eventually, the media moved on to newer tragedies and scandals, and I faded back into anonymity. But for months, I couldn't go anywhere without wondering if people recognized me as that guy whose girlfriend tried to kill him with fake insulin. I started dating again about 18 months after Natalie's conviction, though dating might be too strong a word for the careful, boundaried interactions I had with a woman I met through a diabetes support group. Her name was Claire, and she was also type 1, diagnosed at age 12, and she understood the vulnerability of having a condition that required daily medication to stay alive. We took things extraordinarily slowly, shared our medical histories before we shared much else, and built trust through small, verified actions rather than grand, romantic gestures. She understood why I needed to keep my insulin locked up, why I couldn't let her help with my injections, even after we'd been together for months, why I sometimes woke up in a panic checking my blood sugar levels. She had her own trauma from a previous relationship, where a partner had used her diabetes against her in arguments, threatening to hide her insulin or destroy her supplies during fights. We were both damaged in specific ways that made us compatible, and there was comfort in being with someone who understood that trust had to be earned through consistent action over time. I still think about that night sometimes, about standing in the hallway at 2:18 a.m., listening to Natalie describe how she was killing me. I think about all the small moments I'd missed, all the red flags I'd rationalized away because I'd wanted to believe in our relationship, the way she'd been just a little too eager to help with my medical care, the way she'd suggested I keep my insulin in the refrigerator instead of my usual spot so she could help me stay organized, the way she'd discouraged me from attending my regular diabetes support group meetings because we should spend that time together. In hindsight, every manipulation was obvious. In the moment, living inside the relationship and trusting someone I loved, they'd been invisible. Dr. Shaw told me that was normal, that emotional manipulation worked precisely because it exploited normal human desires for connection and trust. I wasn't stupid for missing the signs. I was human, and Natalie had been a predator who'd spent years perfecting her hunting techniques. The most lasting impact wasn't the physical recovery or even the psychological trauma. It was the fundamental shift in how I understood vulnerability and dependency. Being diabetic meant I would always be dependent on medication to survive, always be one missed dose away from serious medical complications, always have this built-in weakness that made me a target for anyone who wanted to exploit it. I couldn't change that reality, couldn't cure my diabetes or eliminate my dependency on insulin. What I could change was who I allowed close enough to access that vulnerability. I could build better boundaries, verify trust through actions rather than words, and maintain systems that protected me even from the people I cared about. It wasn't the romantic, trusting approach to relationships I'd had before Natalie, but it was realistic, given what I now knew about how easily trust could be weaponized. Detective Kowalski called me about 2 years after the conviction to tell me they'd identified a fourth possible victim in Rebecca's history, a man who died of diabetic complications a decade ago in another state. The case was being reviewed, and my testimony about how Rebecca had coached Natalie might be relevant to understanding that earlier death. I agreed to help however I could, understanding that every victim identified and every case reopened meant fewer chances for killers like Rebecca and Natalie to operate in the future. The investigation was still ongoing when I last spoke to Kowalski, but he was optimistic they'd be able to prove this was a pattern going back even further than they'd initially thought. Each new victim they found made me feel both grateful I'd survived and guilty that I'd been the one to live when others hadn't. Survivor's guilt, Dr. Shaw called it, a normal response to being the lucky one. 3 years after that, 2:18 a.m. discovery that saved my life, I was in a stable relationship with Claire, working at a job I enjoyed, managing my diabetes with the same careful attention I'd had before, but with better security protocols, and slowly learning to trust again in small, measured doses. I'd never be the person I was before Natalie, never have that innocent trust that people were fundamentally who they claimed to be. But I was building something new, something more realistic and resilient, something that acknowledged danger while still allowing for connection. Natalie had tried to destroy me, had come within weeks of succeeding, but I'd survived. Not unchanged, not undamaged, but alive and moving forward despite everything she'd tried to take from me. That felt like victory, even if it was a complicated, painful kind of victory that came with scars I'd carry forever. The final twist came when I received a letter from Natalie in prison, 3 years into her sentence. She wrote that she'd been doing therapy as part of her rehabilitation program, and her therapist had encouraged her to write apology letters to her victims as part of taking accountability. The letter was 2 pages of what read like genuine remorse, explaining that she'd been raised by Rebecca to view relationships as transactional, that she'd never learned to value human life beyond its monetary worth, that she understood now what she'd done was monstrous and unforgivable. She wrote that she didn't expect me to forgive her, didn't even deserve my forgiveness, but wanted me to know that she spent every day in prison thinking about the person she could have been if Rebecca hadn't twisted her into a murderer. I read the letter 3 times, trying to determine if it was genuine or just another manipulation, and ultimately decided it didn't matter. Whether Natalie had actually changed or was just performing remorse made no difference to my life or my recovery. I wrote back one sentence. I hope you spend every day for the next 42 years thinking about what you did to me and to the others. Then I threw her letter away and never responded to any of her subsequent attempts to contact me. Looking back now, I understand that the moment I overheard that conversation was the moment my old life ended and a new one began. The person I was before, who trusted easily and loved without reservation, who believed people were fundamentally good unless proven otherwise, that person died in that hallway at 2:18 a.m. The person I became in his place was harder, more guarded, less willing to be vulnerable. But that person was also more resilient, more aware, more capable of protecting himself from predators who wore the masks of lovers and partners. I missed the innocence sometimes, missed the ease of trusting without verifying, but I valued survival more. Natalie had tried to kill me for $500,000 and failed. She'd spend the rest of her life in prison while I got to build a new life, scarred but surviving, damaged but alive. In the end, that was the justice that mattered most. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.